Welcome to the Waking Up Podcast. This is Sam Harris. Douglas, welcome to the Waking Up Podcast.
It's great to be with you, Sam.
Miriam, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Majid, thanks for coming on the podcast.
A pleasure. Thanks for having me again.
Robert, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Sure, glad to be here.
Siddhartha, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Charles, thanks for coming on the podcast.
It's my pleasure.
Glenn, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Sam, my pleasure.
Sarah, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Gary, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Sam. Pleasure to be here.
Kate, thanks for coming on the podcast.
I'm delighted to be here.
Douglas, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
It's a great pleasure, Sam.
David, thanks for coming on the podcast.
It's a great pleasure.
Jordan, thanks for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Yuval, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here.
Stuart, thanks for coming on the podcast.
You're welcome.
David, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
Graham, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Good to be here.
Scotty, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Absolutely my pleasure. I can't thank you enough for having me on.
Hey, Joshua, how you doing?
I'm very good. Thanks for having me.
How you doing, Max? Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be on.
Lawrence, thanks for coming on the podcast.
It's great to be with you virtually, Sam.
Timothy, thanks for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure.
Ayan, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Sam, thank you very much for having me. Great to talk to you.
Gad, thanks for coming on the podcast.
So great to be with you, Sam.
Neil, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Sam, it's great to be on. Like, you don't call, you don't write.
Peter, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Sam, for having me on the podcast. It's good to be talking with you.
Hey, Paul, how you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm good. Hey, Jerry, how you doing?
Fine, yourself?
I'm good. Hey, Paul, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Sam. How are you?
I'm good. Hey, Megan, how you doing?
I'm really good. How are you?
I'm good. Hey, Dan, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. Andrew, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Sam, for having me.
Shaddy, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hi, Sam. Thanks for having me.
Eric, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me over.
Jamie, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Sam.
Paul, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
Sam, thanks for having me back.
General, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thank you very much.
Gary, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me.
Tristan, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Sam.
Will, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Anne, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
Anne, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me.
Lawrence, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Good to talk to you, Sam.
Max, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
It's a pleasure.
Mark, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Sam.
David, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Pleasure to be with you.
David, thank you for coming on the podcast.
What a pleasure to be here.
Douglas, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
It's a great pleasure to be with you. It's been, almost 2 years.
Jordan, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
My pleasure.
Fareed, thanks for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure, Sam.
Zainab, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
Joseph, thank you for doing this once again.
A pleasure.
Julia, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Joseph, thank you for being here, and thank you for agreeing to talk about all this with me.
I'm delighted to have a chance to get back into the meat of our discussions.
Michael, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Sam.
David, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be talking with you.
Jocko, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me on.
Johan, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much, Sam. You're one of the very few people I know who said my name right first time. Remember the very first time I once waited for 6...
Uma, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Sam. I'm delighted to be here.
Thanks for coming back, Joseph. Thanks for doing this.
It's great.
Jeffrey, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, pleasure to be here, Sam. Thank you for inviting me.
David Tamler, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Sam.
Gavin, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, too.
Kevin, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Oh, man, I'm enjoying this right now.
Nicholas, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Sam.
Cass, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Siddhartha, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Kurt, thanks for coming on the podcast.
My complete pleasure.
David, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. What a pleasure.
Frank, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Sam, nice to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Chris, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Sam, my pleasure. Sorry I made it so hard getting all my tech set up.
Not at all. It's amazing we can do this remotely. Jennifer, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Great to be here, Sam.
David, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
AJ, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Sam.
Dan, Richie, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Pleasure, Sam.
Happy to be here.
Anil, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Eliezer, thanks for coming on the podcast.
You're quite welcome.
Neil, thanks for coming on the podcast.
It's a pleasure, Sam.
Okay, so for better or worse, we're finally doing a podcast together.
We're finally doing it.
Bart, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Scott, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Tamler, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Michael, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Oh, great to be here, Sam.
Robert, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Sam.
Nina, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Masha, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Preet, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
Tom, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Sam. I appreciate it.
Andrew, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, Sam.
Ian, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Sam, my pleasure.
Coleman, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
Marty, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hi, happy to be here.
Jaron, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm here with Bill Maher and Larry Charles. Matt, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Rebecca, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Dia, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Joe, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Sam.
Thomas, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, good to meet you.
Ken and Lynn, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Our pleasure.
Mark, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Good to be here.
John, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
My pleasure, Sam.
Aaron, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. This is so exciting. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, really, it's a treat.